My name is Gloria, and at 28, I thought I knew what real pain felt like. Working as a pediatric nurse in Chicago, I had seen children fight battles that would break most adults. But nothing prepared me for the day my own family would refuse to believe I was fighting for my life. It started as a simple family gathering to clean out my grandmother's house after her passing. What should have been a day of shared memories became the moment I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most can become your greatest danger. Before I share what happened that changed everything, please let me know where you're watching from and hit that like button. Trust me, you won't believe how quickly a family gathering turned into a literal fight for survival. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story has a twist that will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty. Returning to my grandmother's house in the small Ohio town where I grew up always felt like stepping back in time. The Victorian home on Maple Street held 50 years of memories, each room telling stories of Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet afternoons spent learning life lessons from the wisest woman I ever knew. Grandma Rose had been my anchor since I was 7 years old when my mother died from what the doctors vaguely called heart complications. My father Frank never talked about those details, and I learned early not to ask questions that made him uncomfortable. Walking through the front door that morning, I could still smell the faint scent of her lavender perfume mixed with the cinnamon rolls she used to bake every Saturday. The house felt hollow without her gentle humming floating through the hallways, without her voice calling out reminders to wear a sweater or eat something substantial. My chest tightened with grief as I noticed her favorite coffee cup still sitting in the kitchen sink, a small blue ceramic mug with painted roses that she had used every morning for as long as I could remember. Dad had called me the week before with his typical no-nonsense approach. "We need to get the house cleaned out and ready for sale," he had said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of impatience. "Your Aunt Martha and I have already started going through things, but we need an extra pair of hands. Can you get time off work?" There was no discussion about whether I wanted to be part of this process, no acknowledgement that this house held different meanings for different people. In Dad's world, emotions were inefficiencies that slowed down practical matters. I had driven down from Chicago the night before, staying at a small motel rather than in the house where every corner reminded me of my loss. Sleep had been elusive, partly from grief, but also from a strange restlessness I had been feeling for weeks. Working double shifts at the hospital and barely eating regular meals had become my way of coping with stress, though I kept telling myself I was just dedicated to my patients. The exhaustion felt bone deep, but I attributed it to the emotional weight of losing the one person who had always believed in me unconditionally. Aunt Martha arrived shortly after I did her silver sedan, pulling into the driveway with its characteristic precision. She emerged wearing what I had come to think of as her business outfit, a pressed navy blazer and sensible shoes that announced her intention to handle matters efficiently. Martha was Dad's younger sister, but she had always carried herself with an authority that made her seem older. She had never married, dedicating herself instead to her career as a bank manager and to what she considered the important task of managing family affairs. "Gloria." She greeted me with a brief nod, her eyes already scanning the house as if calculating its value. "I trust you're ready to work today. There's a lot to accomplish, and I have appointments tomorrow that I cannot reschedule." Her tone carried the same dismissive quality I remembered from childhood visits, when she would make subtle comments about my mother's weakness and my own tendency toward what she called unnecessary sensitivity. The relationship between Martha and my mother had been complicated, layered with the kind of sibling rivalry that extended beyond childhood. Martha had always been the practical one, the one who made sensible choices and built a stable, predictable life. My mother, Sarah, had been the dreamer, the one who married for love rather than security, and who saw magic in everyday moments. After Mom died, Martha's occasional comments suggested she viewed my mother's death as somehow inevitable, the natural consequence of someone who lived too much in her emotions rather than in practical reality. Dad appeared from the basement carrying a box of old Christmas decorations that had probably not seen daylight in years. At 56, He remained lean and angular, his face weathered from years of working construction before moving into project management. He had taught me early that showing weakness was not acceptable, that problems were solved through determination and hard work, rather than through what he called dwelling on feelings. The day my mother died, he had sat me down and explained that life would continue, that we would manage just fine, and that the best way to honor her memory was to be strong and self-sufficient. "Good you're both here," he said, setting down the box with more force than necessary. "I want to get the upstairs cleared out today. The real estate agent says the market is good right now, but only if we can get this place emptied and cleaned up quickly." He looked directly at me. "I know this is hard for you, but your grandmother would want us to be practical about this. She always said this house was too big for one person anyway." I nodded, swallowing the words I wanted to say about how Grandma Rose had never complained about the house being too big, how she had filled every room with warmth and purpose. Instead, I followed them upstairs to begin the systematic dismantling of a lifetime. The attic was our first destination, a space crammed with decades of accumulated memories. Boxes of photographs, holiday decorations, old clothing, and furniture that had been retired, but never discarded, created a maze that would require careful navigation. As we worked, I found myself growing increasingly uncomfortable. The attic was warm and stuffy, but the sensation I was experiencing felt different from simple overheating. My chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped a band around my ribs and was gradually tightening it. I attributed the feeling to the emotional difficulty of sorting through Grandma's belongings, to the dust and close quarters, to anything other than what my medical training was quietly suggesting in the back of my mind. The morning sun was streaming through the attic windows when we started our work in earnest, casting long shadows across the accumulated treasures of my grandmother's long life. Dad had assigned tasks with military precision. Martha would handle paperwork and valuables. He would focus on furniture and larger items, and I was relegated to what he called the sentimental stuff, with barely concealed impatience. The dismissive way he said it made clear his opinion of anything that could not be easily categorized and efficiently disposed of. I found myself kneeling beside a trunk filled with my mother's belongings, items that Grandma Rose had carefully preserved for nearly 20 years. Photograph albums showed a young woman with my same dark hair and wide smile, captured in moments of joy that seemed to radiate from the faded images. There were letters tied with ribbon, a graduation cap from nursing school, and a small jewelry box that played a tinny version of Fleur Elise when opened. Each item felt like a small piece of a puzzle I had never been allowed to complete, glimpses of a person I had known only through the filter of childhood memory and my father's careful silence. As I lifted the photo albums, a sharp pain shot through my chest, so sudden and intense that I gasped audibly. The sensation felt like someone had driven a spike through my sternum, radiating outward in waves that made my left arm ache and my jaw clench involuntarily. I sat back on my heels, pressing a hand to my chest and trying to catch my breath. The rational part of my mind, trained in medical assessment, began cataloging symptoms even as I tried to dismiss them as stress-related. "What's wrong now?" Dad's voice carried annoyance rather than concern. He was struggling with a heavy wooden dresser, trying to maneuver it toward the attic stairs. "If you're going to sit around looking at pictures all day, we'll never get finished." "I just felt a little dizzy," I managed, though the description hardly captured the intensity of what I was experiencing. The pain in my chest was not subsiding as I had expected. Instead, it seemed to be settling in a constant pressure that made each breath feel insufficient. "Maybe we could open a window. It's pretty stuffy up here." Martha looked up from a box of legal documents she was examining with characteristic thoroughness. "Dizzy, you're not pregnant, are you?" Her tone carried disapproval even for the hypothetical possibility. "Because that would certainly complicate things. We need people who can actually work today, not make excuses." The suggestion stung, partly because of its impossibility, but mostly because of the assumption behind it. In Martha's worldview, any physical discomfort experienced by a woman was either exaggeration or evidence of poor life choices. I had heard her make similar comments about my mother over the years, always with the implication that weakness was a choice rather than a circumstance. "I'm not pregnant," I said, forcing myself to stand despite the continued pressure in my chest. "I'm just tired. I've been working a lot of extra shifts lately." It was true, though it felt inadequate as an explanation for the growing sense that something was seriously wrong with my body. The exhaustion I had been experiencing for weeks suddenly seemed connected to other symptoms I had been ignoring: shortness of breath after climbing stairs, occasional dizziness, a general sense of feeling unwell that I had attributed to stress and grief. Dad was not interested in explanations. "Well, tired or not, these boxes need to move. Your grandmother didn't accumulate all this stuff, so we could spend weeks sorting through it. She was practical about most things, but she never could throw anything away." He gestured toward a stack of boxes near the window. "Start with those. They're mostly old clothes that can go straight to donation." I moved toward the boxes, each step requiring more effort than it should have. The simple act of bending to lift the first box sent another wave of pain through my chest this time, accompanied by a sensation I could only describe as crushing weight. My heart was beating irregularly, sometimes racing and then skipping beats in a pattern that my medical training recognized as potentially dangerous. I straightened slowly, one hand pressed against my chest, trying to breathe deeply enough to relieve the mounting pressure. "This one's heavy," I said, though it was a standard cardboard box that should not have challenged someone of my age and general fitness level. "Could someone help me carry it downstairs?" Martha's laugh held no warmth. "Heavy? It's a box of old dresses. How heavy could it possibly be?" She stood and walked over, hefting the box easily. "See, perfectly manageable. You really do need to get more exercise if a box of clothes is too much for you." The implication was clear: my struggle was evidence of weakness, laziness, or both. It was the same tone she had used throughout my childhood. Whenever I had complained of feeling unwell, the same dismissive attitude that had made me learn early not to voice discomfort or ask for help. But this felt different from childhood complaints about stomach aches or headaches. This felt like my body was sending urgent warnings that I was trained to recognize in patients, but somehow could not acknowledge in myself. As we continued working, I found myself moving more slowly, taking frequent breaks that I tried to disguise as careful examination of items we were sorting. The pain in my chest was not constant, but came in waves, each one more intense than the last. During one particularly severe episode, I had to sit down abruptly on an old wooden chair, my vision blurring at the edges and my hands beginning to shake. "What now?" Dad's exasperation was unmistakable. "We've got a schedule to keep here. The donation truck is coming this afternoon, and we need to have things organized by then." "I think I might be getting sick," I said carefully, knowing that admitting weakness was risky but beginning to feel genuinely frightened by what was happening to my body. "My chest hurts, and I'm having trouble catching my breath." The silence that followed was loaded with familiar frustration. Dad set down the box he was carrying and looked at me with the expression I remembered from childhood, the one that said I was being unreasonable and tiresome. "You're 28 years old," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a difficult child. "You don't have chest pains. You have stress, and probably too much caffeine and not enough real food. When's the last time you ate something besides hospital vending machine snacks?" His question hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. My eating habits had become increasingly erratic as work demands increased and grief consumed my emotional energy. But even acknowledging poor self-care could not explain the intensity of what I was experiencing. The crushing sensation in my chest felt like a physical weight, as if someone were sitting on my sternum while squeezing my heart in their fist. Martha's voice cut through my internal assessment. "This is exactly what your mother used to do." Her words carried the weight of long-held resentment. Every time there was work to be done or responsibility to be handled suddenly, she would have mysterious symptoms that required everyone else to take care of her. "I had hoped you would be different." The comparison to my mother felt like a slap, partly because it was so unfair, and partly because it touched on fears I had carried since childhood. I had spent years trying to prove that I was strong, capable, and self-sufficient, precisely because I did not want to be seen as weak like my mother had apparently been perceived. But hearing Martha's assessment, I began to wonder if my mother's weakness had actually been something more serious, something that had been dismissed and minimized until it was too late. The afternoon heat had intensified by the time we moved downstairs to tackle the living room, and my physical discomfort had escalated from concerning to alarming. We were rearranging furniture to make room for the donation truck, a task that required lifting and moving pieces that had occupied the same spots for decades. Dad had enlisted me to help him relocate Grandma Rose's heavy cedar chest, an antique piece that had belonged to her own mother and held generations of family quilts and linens. "On three," Dad instructed, positioning himself at one end of the chest. 1, 2, 3. We lifted together, and immediately I felt something go terribly wrong in my body. The pain that had been building throughout the morning suddenly exploded across my chest like lightning radiating down my left arm and up into my jaw with an intensity that made me cry out involuntarily. I dropped my end of the chest, which landed heavily on the hardwood floor with a crash that brought Martha running from the kitchen. The sound seemed to echo through the house, but all I could focus on was the crushing sensation that was now spreading through my entire upper body. My left arm felt numb and heavy, my jaw ached as if I had been clenching it for hours, and each breath required conscious effort. "What the hell, Gloria?" Dad's anger flared immediately. "Do you have any idea how much that chest is worth if you've damaged it?" He knelt to examine the furniture for scratches, his concern focused entirely on the antique rather than on my obvious distress. I sank into Grandma's armchair, the same overstuffed blue recliner, where she had spent countless evenings reading or watching her favorite television shows. The familiar comfort of the chair could not penetrate the fear that was now overwhelming me as my medical training kicked into high gear. The constellation of symptoms I was experiencing, the pattern of pain, the timing and intensity, all pointed to one terrifying conclusion that my family seemed determined to ignore. "I think I'm having a heart attack." I said the words coming out in a breathless whisper. Even saying it aloud felt surreal, as if I were diagnosing a patient rather than acknowledging my own medical emergency. At 28, with no obvious risk factors beyond stress and poor eating habits, it seemed impossible. But my body was telling a different story than my expectations. Dad's reaction was immediate and explosive. "A heart attack? Are you out of your mind? You're a healthy young woman with an overactive imagination. Heart attacks happen to overweight men in their 50s, not to dramatic nurses who watch too many medical shows." His dismissal was so complete, so confident, that for a moment I doubted my own assessment. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe the pain was muscular, caused by lifting heavy boxes and furniture. Maybe my medical training was making me paranoid, seeing serious conditions where only minor problems existed. But even as I tried to rationalize away my symptoms, the crushing pressure in my chest intensified, and my heart began beating with an irregular rhythm that felt like a fish flopping in my chest. Martha appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. "What's all the noise about? We have work to finish, and I don't have time for delays." She took in the scene, the displaced chest, me slumped in the chair looking pale and frightened, and Dad's obvious irritation. "Gloria claims she's having a heart attack." Dad said, his tone making clear his opinion of this assertion. "Apparently lifting furniture is too strenuous for our big city nurse." Martha's laugh was sharp and unsympathetic. "A heart attack. How convenient. Just when we get to the heavy lifting, suddenly you have a medical emergency." She moved closer, studying my face with the calculating look I remembered from childhood. "You look perfectly fine to me. A little pale, maybe, but that's probably from staying indoors too much in Chicago." I tried to stand, thinking that moving around might help alleviate some of the pressure, but my legs felt unsteady and weak. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I had to grip the arms of the chair to keep from falling. My vision was starting to blur at the edges, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the air conditioning. "Please," I managed my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Something is really wrong. I need to call 911. The request seemed to infuriate Dad even more. You are not calling an ambulance. Do you have any idea what that costs? What it will do to the resale value of this house if the neighbors see emergency vehicles here? You're having anxiety, maybe a panic attack from all the emotional stress of being back here. Take some deep breaths and stop being so dramatic. His refusal to take my symptoms seriously felt like another crushing weight on my chest. Here I was, a trained medical professional, clearly experiencing a cardiac event, and my own family was treating me like a hysterical child seeking attention. The irony was not lost on me that I spent my days advocating for young patients, ensuring their symptoms were taken seriously, and their pain was addressed while my own family dismissed my clear distress as manipulation. Martha crossed her arms, a gesture that had always signaled her final judgment on a matter. This is exactly what your mother used to do, she said, her voice carrying decades of resentment. Every family gathering, every time there was work to be done or difficult conversations to be had, suddenly Sarah would have mysterious health problems that required everyone to stop what they were doing and focus on her. The comparison stung deeper than any physical pain I was experiencing. My mother had been dead for over 20 years, but Martha's version of her had been carefully preserved and frequently referenced whenever my behavior seemed to echo traits that Martha had disapproved of in her sister-in-law. I had grown up hearing subtle criticisms of my mother's weakness, her attention-seeking, her inability to handle stress without physical symptoms. For the first time, I began to wonder if my mother's health problems had been real, if she had been dismissed and minimized the same way I was being dismissed now. The thought that she might have suffered not just from illness, but from the additional burden of not being believed made my current situation feel even more desperate and isolating. I'm not my mother, I said, though my voice lacked the strength I intended. I'm a nurse. I know what I'm talking about. These symptoms are real and they're dangerous. Dad was already shaking his head before I finished speaking. You're a pediatric nurse, not a cardiologist. And you're too emotionally invested in this situation to make rational medical judgments about yourself. What you need is to calm down, drink some water, and help us finish what we came here to do. As if to emphasize his point, he moved to the other end of the cedar chest, clearly expecting me to resume helping him move it. The expectation that I would continue physical labor while experiencing what I was certain was a heart attack felt surreal, like being trapped in a nightmare where the rules of logic and safety no longer applied. I tried once more to stand, hoping that I could reach my purse and call for help myself, but this time my legs gave out completely. I collapsed back into the chair, my vision tunneling as waves of pain crashed through my chest and down my arm. The irregular heartbeat was becoming more pronounced, and I could feel my pulse racing and then stuttering in a pattern that terrified me with its implications. Please help me, I whispered, though I was no longer sure if I was speaking to my family or to God, or to the grandmother whose presence I felt so strongly in this house where she had always protected me. What happened next will stay with me forever, not just because of the physical crisis, but because of the emotional devastation of watching my own family choose their convenience over my life. I was on the floor now, having slumped out of the armchair, when another crushing wave of pain made it impossible to remain upright. The hardwood was cool against my cheek, a small relief in the midst of the fire that seemed to be consuming my chest from the inside out. Dad was standing over me, his face red with frustration, and what I was beginning to recognize as embarrassment. In his worldview, I was creating a scene that reflected poorly on his parenting, his family, his ability to handle a simple task like cleaning out a house. The possibility that I might actually be dying seemed less important to him than the inconvenience of dealing with what he had decided was theatrical behavior. Quit faking it. He exploded, his voice echoing through the house with such force that it seemed to shake the windows. This manipulation stops. Now I will not have you turning your grandmother's house into a stage for your dramatic performance. Each word felt like a physical blow. I was struggling to breathe, my vision fading in and out, my heart beating so irregularly that I could feel my pulse skipping and racing unpredictably. Yet the man who was supposed to protect me, who should have been the first person to believe me and help me, was treating my medical emergency as a behavioral problem that needed to be corrected through anger and intimidation. Martha had moved closer, looking down at me with the cold assessment of someone evaluating a particularly troublesome employee. "Just like when you faked being sick for school," she said, her voice carrying satisfaction at having identified what she considered a pattern of behavior. "Remember how you used to complain about stomach aches every Monday morning? And that time you said you had chest pains during the middle school track meet? Always something dramatic, always requiring special attention." Her words transported me back to childhood moments I had forgotten, times when I had indeed felt sick or scared or overwhelmed, but had learned to keep quiet, because expressing distress was seen as weakness or manipulation. I began to wonder how many genuine problems I had suffered through in silence, because asking for help had been trained out of me by reactions like this. But this was different. This was not childhood anxiety or Monday morning reluctance to go to school. This was my heart muscle dying from lack of oxygen, my cardiovascular system failing in ways that could kill me within minutes. The medical knowledge I had gained through years of education and practice was screaming warnings that my family was determined to ignore. I tried to crawl toward my purse, which I had left on the kitchen counter. My phone was inside, and if I could reach it, I could call for help myself. But the movement sent another lightning bolt of pain through my chest, and my left arm was now so numb and heavy that it was difficult to use for support. "Where do you think you're going?" Dad demanded, stepping into my path. "You're not going anywhere until you stop this nonsense and help us finish what we started." The absurdity of the situation hit me like another wave of pain. Here I was, crawling across my dead grandmother's floor while experiencing a heart attack, and my father was blocking my access to emergency help because he thought I was avoiding household chores. If the situation were not so terrifying, it would have been almost comically absurd. Martha was watching my struggle with what appeared to be clinical interest. "She's really committed to this performance," she observed to Dad. "I have to give her credit for thoroughness. The crawling is a nice touch." Her comment sparked a memory that made everything suddenly horribly clear. I remembered a conversation I had overheard as a child, Martha and Dad talking about my mother in hushed tones after a family gathering. Martha had said something about Sarah always finding ways to be the center of attention, and how some people just can't handle normal stress without falling apart. For the first time, I understood that my mother might have been seriously ill during those times when the family had dismissed her symptoms as attention-seeking behavior. The realization that she might have suffered not just from physical illness, but from the emotional trauma of not being believed by the people who were supposed to love her, made my current situation feel even more urgent and desperate. My heart rhythm was becoming increasingly erratic. As a nurse, I knew enough about cardiac emergencies to recognize that I was moving into dangerous territory, the kind of irregular beating patterns that could lead to cardiac arrest. The crushing pain in my chest was intensifying, spreading up into my neck and jaw, down my left arm and into my back. Classic textbook symptoms that any first-year medical student would recognize. "I'm going to die," I whispered, though I was not sure if I said it aloud or just thought it. The possibility that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness was now front and center. Young, healthy people did sometimes have heart attacks, especially when there were underlying genetic conditions that had never been diagnosed. And if my family continued to prevent me from getting help, that possibility was becoming more likely with each passing minute. Dad was pacing now, his frustration evident in every step. "Enough," he shouted. "I am not calling an ambulance for a temper tantrum. You will get up, you will help us finish this work, and you will stop embarrassing this family with your ridiculous theatrics." I tried to speak to explain once more what was happening to my body, but I was having trouble forming words. The pain was so intense that it was difficult to think clearly, and my breathing had become shallow and rapid. I was beginning to feel disconnected from my surroundings, as if I were observing the scene from somewhere outside my body. That was when I lost consciousness for the first time, slumping completely onto the floor as my oxygen-starved brain finally gave up the struggle to remain aware. The last thing I remember before the darkness closed in was Martha's voice saying, "Well, this is certainly dramatic enough. Wake me up when the performance is over." When I came to a few moments later, they were still standing there, still refusing to acknowledge that anything serious was happening. Dad was checking his watch, clearly annoyed by the delay in his schedule. Martha was examining her fingernails with elaborate boredom. It was then that I heard the sound that probably saved my life. The front doorbell followed by a familiar voice calling out a cheerful hello. Mrs. Henderson's arrival felt like divine intervention, though at first I was too disoriented to fully understand what was happening. Eleanor Henderson had been my grandmother's next-door neighbor for 30 years, a retired nurse who had become one of Grandma Rose's closest friends in her later years. She had her own key to the house, and the kind of relationship that allowed her to walk in unannounced, especially during times of family crisis or celebration. "Rose always said to come by if I saw cars in the driveway," Mrs. Henderson was saying as she entered through the kitchen, carrying what appeared to be a covered casserole dish. "I brought some of that tuna noodle casserole she always liked for—" Her voice trailed off as she took in the scene in the living room. I was still on the floor, my face probably gray with pain and shock, clearly in medical distress. Dad and Martha were standing nearby looking annoyed rather than concerned, their body language suggesting irritation rather than alarm. To someone with Mrs. Henderson's medical background, the disconnect between my obvious emergency and my family's casual response must have been immediately apparent. "Good Lord," she said, setting down the casserole and moving quickly to kneel beside me. "What's happened here? How long has she been like this?" Her hands were already checking my pulse at my wrist and neck, her experienced fingers finding the irregular, rapid heartbeat that confirmed her immediate assessment. I could see the concern in her face as she felt the telltale rhythm of a heart in crisis, the kind of emergency she had probably responded to countless times during her nursing career. "She's having a heart attack," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying the authority of professional knowledge. "How long has she been experiencing symptoms? Have you called 911? Dad shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that an outside observer might view the situation differently than he had chosen to interpret it. "She's been complaining about chest pain, but she's only 28. We thought it was just stress from being back here, emotional stuff from losing Rose." Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened as she continued her assessment. My pulse was rapid and irregular. My skin was clammy and pale, and my breathing was shallow and labored. These were not the symptoms of emotional distress, but of a serious cardiac event requiring immediate medical intervention. "This child is having a heart attack," she repeated, her voice sharp with urgency and what sounded like barely contained anger. "The emotional stress doesn't matter. The age doesn't matter. She needs emergency medical care right now." She was already reaching for her cell phone, dialing 911 with the efficiency of someone who had made similar calls many times before. Dad moved as if to stop her, but something in her expression made him step back. 911. "I need an ambulance at 847 Maple Street immediately. I have a 28-year-old female experiencing what appears to be an acute myocardial infarction. She's conscious but in severe distress, irregular pulse, classic presentation." Martha was watching this interaction with obvious discomfort, her certainty about my performance beginning to waver in the face of Mrs. Henderson's professional assessment. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I mean, she's been acting strange all day, but a heart attack seems pretty extreme for someone her age." Mrs. Henderson finished her call and looked up at Martha with the kind of stern expression that probably made younger nurses scramble to improve their patient care. "I've been a cardiac nurse for 40 years, she said. "I know what a heart attack looks like, and I know what family denial looks like too. This girl could die if we don't get her help immediately." The words, "could die," seemed to penetrate Dad's defensive wall of disbelief for the first time. He looked down at me with what might have been the beginning of genuine concern, though it was mixed with confusion and embarrassment about his previous reactions. "But she's so young," he said, as if repeating this fact could somehow change the medical reality of what was happening to my body. "Young people can have heart attacks. Mrs. Henderson explained curtly while continuing to monitor my condition. Especially if there are underlying genetic conditions, stress factors, or other risk factors that haven't been identified. The age doesn't protect her from cardiac events. I could hear sirens in the distance growing closer with each second. The sound filled me with relief so profound that I began to cry, tears mixing with the sweat that was covering my face. Help was coming. Professional medical help from people who would believe what my body was telling them, who would treat my symptoms as legitimate rather than as manipulation or attention-seeking behavior. Mrs. Henderson kept her hand on my wrist, monitoring my pulse while speaking to me in the calm, reassuring tone I recognized from my own nursing practice. "The ambulance is almost here, honey. You're going to be okay. They'll take good care of you at the hospital." Dad was pacing again, but now his agitation seemed to stem from worry rather than anger. "I don't understand how this could happen. She seemed fine this morning, a little tired, but nothing like this." "Heart attacks can present gradually or suddenly," Mrs. Henderson explained without taking her attention away from me. "The symptoms she's been describing, the chest pain, the shortness of breath, the arm pain, these are classic warning signs that should never be ignored, especially in someone with potential family history." Martha had grown very quiet. Her earlier certainty replaced by what looked like dawning understanding of how seriously she had misjudged the situation. "Family history?" she asked. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson looked up at her sharply. "Your sister-in-law, Sarah. Rose told me she died of heart complications when she was young. Has anyone ever investigated whether there might be genetic factors that could affect Gloria?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I saw recognition, and something that might have been guilt cross Martha's face as she made connections that should have been obvious much earlier. Dad was staring at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time all day. The ambulance pulled into the driveway with sirens blaring, and within moments, EMTs were streaming through the front door with equipment and professional urgency. The lead EMT was a middle-aged man with graying hair, who moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had responded to thousands of emergency calls. "What do we have here?" he asked Mrs. Henderson, recognizing her as someone with medical knowledge who could provide a reliable report. 28-year-old female, acute onset of chest pain, irregular pulse, classic MI presentation, she reported. Symptoms have been building for several hours. Family initially thought it was anxiety. The EMT was already checking my vital signs, his face growing serious as he felt my pulse and noted my appearance. "Ma'am, can you tell me about your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? 8. I whispered, though it felt closer to 10. "Crushing. Left arm. Jaw." He looked up at his partner and said the words that finally made my family understand the gravity of what was happening. "We need that stretcher now. This is a real MI and we need to move fast." The next hour passed in a blur of professional medical activity that stood in stark contrast to the dismissive treatment I had received from my family. The EMTs worked with swift precision, starting an IV administering oxygen and carefully monitoring my heart rhythm as they prepared to transport me to the hospital. The cardiac monitor showed the irregular patterns I had been feeling, visual proof that my symptoms had been real and dangerous from the beginning. "How long has she been experiencing symptoms?" the lead EMT asked my father, while his partner prepared medications to stabilize my heart rhythm. Dad looked uncomfortable with the question, probably realizing how his answer would sound to medical professionals. "She started complaining about chest pain this morning, maybe around 10 or 11. But we thought it was just stress. She's been emotional about cleaning out her grandmother's house." The EMT's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the quick glance he exchanged with his partner. In their world, chest pain in anyone was taken seriously until proven otherwise, regardless of age or presumed emotional state. The delay in calling for help was noted but not commented on directly. "Any family history of heart disease," the EMT continued as they loaded me onto the stretcher. "Her mother died young," Martha said quietly, speaking up for the first time since the professionals had arrived. "Heart complications, but we never really knew the details." This information clearly concerned the EMT. Young women with family history of cardiac death were exactly the demographic that could experience early heart attacks, especially under conditions of stress or other risk factors. The genetic component that my family had never investigated might have been the missing piece of a puzzle that could have saved my mother's life if it had been recognized earlier. As they wheeled me toward the ambulance, I caught sight of my father's face. The anger and frustration were gone, replaced by something that looked like fear and perhaps the beginning of guilt. For the first time since the crisis began, he seemed to understand that his daughter had been genuinely fighting for her life, while he dismissed her suffering as manipulation. "I'll follow you to the hospital," he called out as they loaded me into the ambulance. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the back of the ambulance before they closed the doors. "I'm going to call your supervisor at the hospital," she said to me. "They need to know what's happened. And don't worry about anything here. I'll make sure the house is secured." The ride to the hospital was a controlled emergency with the EMTs monitoring my heart rhythm and preparing for the possibility that my condition could deteriorate rapidly. They were in radio contact with the emergency department describing my symptoms and vital signs to the team that would take over my care. 28-year-old female acute MI irregular rhythm family history, positive for cardiac death. I heard one of them report. ETA 5 minutes. At the hospital, everything happened with the kind of coordinated urgency that I had observed from the other side as a nurse but had never experienced as a patient. The emergency team was waiting when we arrived, and I was immediately moved to a cardiac treatment room where doctors and nurses worked to stabilize my condition and determine the extent of damage to my heart. Dr. Martinez, the attending cardiologist, was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and steady hands who explained each step of the treatment process as it unfolded. "We're going to do an immediate cardiac catheterization," she told me. "This will let us see exactly what's happening with your coronary arteries and hopefully restore blood flow to your heart muscle." The procedure revealed what the medical team had suspected: a significant blockage in my left anterior descending artery, the vessel that supplies blood to a large portion of the heart muscle. The blockage was caused by a blood clot that had formed on what appeared to be an underlying plaque formation, exactly the kind of condition that could have genetic components. "You have a condition called familial hypercholesterolemia," Dr. Martinez explained after the successful placement of a stent had restored blood flow to my heart. "It's a genetic condition that causes high cholesterol levels and early development of coronary artery disease. It's often undiagnosed until someone has a cardiac event." The diagnosis was both terrifying and vindicating. My symptoms had been real, my medical emergency had been genuine, and the genetic condition explained not only my heart attack, but quite possibly my mother's death 20 years earlier. If this condition had been recognized and treated in our family, both of our lives might have been very different. My father and Martha arrived at the hospital about an hour after my procedure, looking shaken and uncertain. They approached my room hesitantly, as if unsure of their welcome after the morning's events. Dad's usual confidence was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an awkwardness that suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his misjudgment. "How is she?" he asked Dr. Martinez, his voice subdued. "She's stable now," the doctor replied. "We were able to restore blood flow to her heart, and the damage appears to be minimal because we caught it relatively early. But I have to tell you, another hour or two of delay could have been catastrophic." The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Another hour or two was exactly how long my family had spent dismissing my symptoms and preventing me from getting help. The realization that their disbelief had nearly cost me my life was written clearly on both their faces. Dr. Martinez continued her explanation. "The genetic testing confirms familial hypercholesterolemia, which explains why someone so young would have this kind of cardiac event. It also suggests that other family members should be tested, as this condition is inherited." Martha was very quiet, but I could see her processing the implications of this information. If the condition was genetic, and if my mother had died of heart complications at a young age, then the pattern was obvious. My mother's death, might have been preventable if the family history had been properly understood and managed. "What does this mean for her future?" Dad asked. "With proper management, people with this condition can live normal, healthy lives," Dr. Martinez explained. "It requires medication, lifestyle modifications, and regular monitoring. The important thing is that it's been identified now and we can prevent future cardiac events." As the medical team continued their explanations and preparations for my ongoing care, I lay in the hospital bed processing not just the physical trauma of the heart attack, but the emotional trauma of how my family had responded to my crisis. The medical emergency was being successfully treated, but the relationship damage felt more complicated and potentially longer lasting. I had nearly died not just from a genetic heart condition, but from my family's refusal to believe that my suffering was real. The combination of medical crisis and emotional betrayal left me feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life, even as I was surrounded by competent, caring medical professionals who took my symptoms seriously and treated my life as valuable. The days that followed my heart attack were a strange mixture of physical recovery and emotional reckoning. The cardiac rehabilitation unit at the hospital became my temporary home while my heart muscle healed, and my medical team worked to establish the optimal treatment plan for managing my genetic condition. The physical aspects of recovery were straightforward medications to prevent future clots, dietary changes to manage cholesterol, and a gradual return to normal activity levels. The emotional recovery was far more complicated. Dad and Martha visited regularly, but their presence was marked by an uncomfortable awkwardness that reflected their growing understanding of how badly they had misjudged the situation. Their attempts at conversation were stilted and careful, as if they were afraid that acknowledging the severity of their mistake might make the situation worse. "I brought you some magazines," Martha said during one visit, setting a stack of publications on my bedside table. "I thought you might be bored just lying here." It was a gesture toward normalcy, but it felt hollow given what had transpired between us. The woman who had accused me of faking a medical emergency was now trying to manage her guilt through small offerings of comfort that could not address the fundamental damage to our relationship. Dad's visits were even more strained. He would sit in the chair beside my bed making awkward small talk about hospital food, or commenting on the weather, carefully avoiding any mention of the morning when he had stood over me shouting about manipulation while I was literally dying. His discomfort was obvious, but so was his inability to directly address what had happened. "The doctors seem to think you're doing well," he said during one particularly uncomfortable visit. "That's good news. You'll be back to normal before you know it." But I was beginning to understand that normal was no longer an option, at least not the version of normal that had existed before my heart attack. The medical crisis had revealed truths about my family dynamics that could not be unseen or ignored. The pattern of dismissing my symptoms, comparing me unfavorably to my mother, and prioritizing their convenience over my well-being was not something that had developed overnight. It was the culmination of years of subtle undermining that I had learned to accept as standard family behavior. Mrs. Henderson visited more frequently than my own family members, bringing updates about the progress of cleaning out Grandma's house and offering the kind of emotional support that felt genuine rather than obligatory. She had known my grandmother well enough to understand the family dynamics, and her perspective on the situation was both illuminating and validating. "Your grandmother used to worry about how Frank and Martha treated you," she told me during one visit. "She never said much directly, but I could tell she was concerned about their attitude toward your mother's memory and how that affected you." This revelation was both comforting and heartbreaking. Knowing that Grandma Rose had recognized the problem made me feel less alone in my perceptions, but it also highlighted how isolated I had been within my own family structure. The person who had protected and believed me was gone, leaving me to navigate relationships with people who had demonstrated their willingness to prioritize their own comfort over my safety. The genetic counselor who worked with cardiac patients helped me understand not just the medical implications of my condition, but also the family history that had remained hidden for so long. She explained how familial hypercholesterolemia was inherited, and how it typically manifested across generations, painting a picture of my mother's death that was very different from the vague heart complications that had been the family's standard explanation. Based on the pattern and your mother's age at death, it's highly likely that she had the same condition, the counselor explained. If it had been recognized and treated, her outcome might have been very different. This possibility haunted me in ways that went beyond personal grief. If my mother had suffered from the same dismissive treatment when she reported cardiac symptoms, if her complaints of chest pain or shortness of breath had been attributed to emotional weakness or attention-seeking behavior, then she had died not just from a genetic condition, but from a family pattern of not believing women's reports of their own physical experiences. The thought that my mother might have died from the same combination of genetic predisposition and family dismissal that had nearly killed me was almost unbearable. It suggested a tragic pattern that could have been broken if anyone had taken women's cardiac symptoms seriously, or if the family had been willing to investigate genetic factors that might affect multiple generations. During my second week in the hospital, I made a decision that surprised even me with its clarity and finality. I asked the social worker to help me draft a letter to my father and Martha, explaining my need to establish boundaries that would protect my physical and emotional health going forward. The letter was not angry or accusatory, but it was direct about the changes that would need to occur in our relationships. I need you to understand that what happened was not a misunderstanding or a communication problem, I wrote. You chose not to believe me when I told you I was having a medical emergency. You prioritized your schedule and your assumptions over my life. While I'm grateful that Mrs. Henderson arrived when she did, I cannot pretend that your response was acceptable or that it can be explained away by surprise or confusion. The letter went on to explain that I would be limiting contact while I focused on my health and recovery, and that any future relationship would require acknowledgement of what had occurred and genuine changes in how they treated my perspectives and experiences. It was not an ultimatum exactly, but it was a clear statement that the old patterns of dismissal and minimization were no longer acceptable to me. Dad's response to the letter was immediate, but predictably defensive. He called the hospital wanting to discuss my unreasonable expectations and my inability to understand that they had been doing their best in a confusing situation. The conversation confirmed my decision to maintain distance. Even faced with clear evidence of their poor judgment, he was more concerned with defending his actions than with understanding their impact. Martha's response was silence, which was perhaps more honest than attempts at justification. She had always been someone who preferred to avoid uncomfortable truths rather than confront them directly, and my medical crisis had presented truths that were too uncomfortable to acknowledge while maintaining her preferred version of family dynamics. As my discharge date approached, I made arrangements to return to Chicago rather than to stay in Ohio for the continued house cleaning. The symbolic importance of this choice was not lost on me. I was choosing my own health and safety over family obligations, choosing to prioritize my recovery over their convenience, making the kind of self-protective decision that I had been trained since childhood to view as selfish. But the heart attack had taught me that self-protection was not selfish when it was literally a matter of life and death. My family had demonstrated their willingness to let me die rather than inconvenience themselves with an ambulance call. That level of callousness could not be remedied through apologies or good intentions. It required fundamental changes in how they viewed my worth and autonomy as a person. The discharge planning process included extensive education about managing my cardiac condition, but it also included resources for emotional support as I processed the trauma of both the medical emergency and the family crisis. The hospital social worker connected me with support groups for young cardiac patients and counseling resources for dealing with family dysfunction related to medical issues. What you experienced is unfortunately not uncommon, she explained. Many patients, especially young women, report that their families initially dismiss their cardiac symptoms. The combination of age bias, gender bias, and family dynamics can create dangerous delays in seeking treatment. Knowing that my experience was part of a larger pattern provided some comfort, but it also highlighted how much work remained to be done in educating families about the reality of cardiac disease in young people, especially women. My case would become part of that educational effort, but first I needed to focus on my own healing and recovery. 6 months later, my life in Chicago had been transformed in ways I could never have imagined. The cardiac rehabilitation program had not only restored my physical strength, but had connected me with a community of people who understood the unique challenges of being a young person with heart disease. The support group meetings introduced me to others who had faced similar family dynamics, and their stories helped me understand that my experience was part of a broader pattern of how serious medical conditions in young people are often minimized or dismissed. My cardiologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, had become not just my physician, but something of a mentor in learning to advocate for my own health needs. She was only a few years older than me, a fellow professional woman who understood the pressures of working in healthcare while managing a chronic condition. Our appointments had evolved beyond simple medical checkups into discussions about work-life balance, stress management, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who take your health seriously. "Your numbers look excellent," she said during my 6-month follow-up appointment. "The medication is working well, your cholesterol levels are well controlled, and your heart function has returned to normal. From a medical standpoint, you're doing everything right." The success of my physical recovery was deeply satisfying, but it was the emotional and social changes in my life that felt most significant. I had been promoted to charge nurse in the pediatric ICU, a position that allowed me to advocate more effectively for young patients and their families. My experience with medical dismissal had made me more sensitive to situations where children's symptoms might be minimized or where family dynamics might interfere with appropriate medical care. I had also begun volunteering with a local organization that provided education about heart disease in young women, sharing my story as part of awareness campaigns designed to help both patients and families recognize the signs of cardiac emergencies. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful, especially when I met families who were dealing with similar situations. "Your story probably saved my daughter's life," one mother told me after a presentation at a community health fair. "When she started having chest pain, I remembered what you said about not dismissing symptoms based on age. We went straight to the emergency room instead of waiting to see if it would go away." Her daughter had indeed been having a heart attack at age 25, caused by a rare genetic condition that might have gone undiagnosed if her family had not taken her symptoms seriously from the beginning. Knowing that my experience had contributed to better outcomes for other families provided a sense of purpose that helped balance the trauma of my own experience. My relationship with Dad and Martha remained complicated and distant. Dad had made several attempts to rebuild our connection, sending cards and occasional texts that suggested he was beginning to understand the severity of what had occurred. His messages were awkward and carefully worded, as if he were afraid of saying something that might make the situation worse. "I've been thinking about what happened," one text read. "I know I handled things badly. I hope you're doing well with your recovery." His attempts at reconciliation were appreciated, but insufficient to rebuild trust that had been so fundamentally damaged. Acknowledging that he had handled things badly fell far short of understanding that he had been willing to let me die, rather than believe my reports of my own physical experience. The gap between his minimal acknowledgement and the magnitude of the betrayal remained too wide to bridge through simple apologies. Martha's silence had continued for months, but she had eventually sent a brief email that seemed designed more to assuage her own guilt than to repair our relationship. "I hope you understand that we were all under stress that day," she wrote. "None of us meant for things to go the way they did." The email's focus on their stress, rather than on my near-death experience, perfectly captured the self-centeredness that had characterized their response to my medical emergency. Even in attempting an apology, she was more concerned with explaining their behavior than with acknowledging its impact on me. I had responded to both Dad and Martha with brief, polite messages acknowledging their communications, but making clear that I was not ready for extended contact or attempts to return to previous relationship patterns. The boundary setting was difficult but necessary for my emotional health and ongoing recovery. The most significant positive change in my life was the relationship I had developed with Marcus, a fellow healthcare professional I had met during cardiac rehabilitation. He was a physical therapist who had experienced his own heart attack at age 32, and our shared understanding of living with cardiac disease had created a foundation for genuine intimacy and mutual support. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a heart attack," he said during one of our evening walks through Lincoln Park. "But meeting you has made me reconsider that perspective." His understanding of the medical aspects of my condition, combined with his own experience of family members who had struggled to accept his diagnosis, created a level of empathy and support that I had never experienced in my family relationships. He celebrated my health milestones, reminded me to take medications, and never questioned the validity of my symptoms or concerns about my cardiac health. Our relationship had progressed slowly and carefully, both of us aware that cardiac patients sometimes struggled with intimacy issues related to fears about physical exertion or future health crises. But the foundation of mutual respect and understanding had created a partnership that felt both safe and emotionally fulfilling. "You deserve someone who believes you when you say something is wrong," he had told me early in our relationship. "That should be the minimum requirement for anyone in your life." His perspective had helped me understand that my family's dismissive treatment had not been normal or acceptable, even by the standards of people who struggled with medical issues. The contrast between his supportive response to my health concerns and my family's dismissive reactions highlighted just how dysfunctional the family patterns had been. I had also reconnected with some distant cousins on my mother's side relationships that had been discouraged during my childhood, but that provided important connections to my maternal family history. Through these conversations, I learned more about my mother's experiences with health problems and family dynamics that had shaped her short life. Sarah used to talk about feeling like nobody believed her when she said she didn't feel well. My cousin Jennifer told me during a phone call. "She said your dad and Martha always acted like she was being dramatic or looking for attention." This confirmation of the family pattern that had nearly killed me was both validating and heartbreaking. My mother had suffered not just from an undiagnosed genetic condition, but from the same dismissive treatment that had been directed at me. The realization that she had died, feeling disbelieved and minimized, added another layer of grief to my processing of family dynamics. But it also strengthened my resolve to break the cycle. By establishing boundaries with family members who could not respect my health needs, and by building relationships with people who took my experiences seriously, I was creating the kind of supportive environment that my mother had never been able to access. The 6-month anniversary of my heart attack fell on a Tuesday in October, a day that I marked not with grief but with gratitude for the life I had been able to build since my medical crisis. I had survived not just the cardiac event itself, but the emotional trauma of family betrayal, and I had used both experiences to create a more authentic and supportive life. As I reflect on this journey 1 year later, I'm sitting in the same Chicago apartment where I've built a new kind of family, one based on choice rather than genetics, on respect rather than obligation. The morning sun is streaming through windows that overlook a city where I've learned to trust my own instincts and surround myself with people who value my life and health as much as I do. The healing process has been long and complex, involving not just cardiac rehabilitation, but extensive therapy to process the trauma of experiencing a life-threatening emergency while being dismissed and invalidated by the people who were supposed to protect me. Working with Dr. Rebecca Santos, a therapist who specializes in medical trauma and family dysfunction, has helped me understand that what I experienced was a form of medical gaslighting that occurs when family members refuse to believe a person's reports of their own physical symptoms. "Your family's response was not just unsupportive," Dr. Santos explained during one of our sessions. "It was actively dangerous. They created a situation where you could have died, not from the heart attack itself, but from their refusal to allow you to access medical care." Understanding this distinction has been crucial to my healing process. The heart attack, was a medical emergency caused by a genetic condition that I could not have prevented. But the delay in treatment, the emotional trauma of not being believed, and the additional risk to my life were all consequences of family dynamics that reflected deeper patterns of dismissal and control. Through therapy, I've learned to recognize how my childhood experiences had trained me to accept invalidation as normal family behavior. The subtle messages that my mother was weak or dramatic, the dismissal of my own childhood complaints about feeling unwell, and the expectation that I should always prioritize others' comfort over my own needs, had created a foundation that made it easier for my family to dismiss my cardiac emergency. You were conditioned to doubt your own perceptions. Dr. Santos helped me understand. That conditioning almost killed you. Breaking free from these patterns has required learning to trust my own body and instincts in ways that feel revolutionary after years of being taught to minimize my own experiences. Simple things like acknowledging when I'm tired, asking for help when I need it, or insisting on medical attention when something feels wrong have become acts of self-preservation and self-respect. My work in the pediatric ICU has been transformed by this personal experience. I've become known among my colleagues as someone who advocates fiercely for young patients whose symptoms might be dismissed or minimized. When a 15-year-old girl came to our unit complaining of chest pain that her parents attributed to anxiety about school, I insisted on a full cardiac workup that revealed an underlying heart condition requiring immediate treatment. "You saved that girl's life," her mother told me weeks later. "If you hadn't pushed for those tests, we would have sent her home and told her to calm down." These professional experiences reinforce the importance of believing patients, especially young women, when they report symptoms that don't fit expected patterns. My story has become part of the teaching curriculum at the hospital, used to train medical staff about the importance of taking all cardiac symptoms seriously, regardless of the patient's age or family dynamics. The relationship with Marcus has continued to develop into something that feels both stable and transformative. We've learned to navigate the unique challenges of two cardiac patients building a life together, supporting each other through medical appointments, medication adjustments, and the occasional anxiety about future health challenges. Our shared experience has created a level of understanding and mutual care that I had never imagined possible. "I love that you never question whether my symptoms are real," I told him recently. "It's such a basic thing, but it still feels miraculous to be believed without having to prove myself." "That's what love should look like," he replied. "Believing your partner when they tell you something is wrong and doing whatever it takes to help them feel better." His perspective has helped me understand what healthy relationships should look like, in contrast to the dysfunctional patterns I had learned to accept as normal. The difference between being supported and being dismissed, between being believed and being gaslit, has become a clear standard for evaluating all relationships in my life. The distance from my father and Martha has remained consistent, though both have made occasional attempts at reconciliation that demonstrate varying levels of understanding about what occurred. Dad's efforts have become more thoughtful over time, suggesting that he has done some genuine reflection about his behavior and its consequences. "I've been reading about heart attacks in young women," he wrote in a recent letter. "I'm beginning to understand how wrong I was about everything that day. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to learn from this." His acknowledgement represents progress, though it remains insufficient to rebuild the trust that was so fundamentally damaged. The willingness to educate himself about cardiac disease in young women suggests a level of commitment to understanding that had been completely absent during my medical crisis. Martha's communications have been less frequent and less insightful, usually consisting of holiday cards or brief messages that avoid addressing what happened while expressing hope that we can move past the difficulties. Her inability to directly acknowledge her role in endangering my life suggests that genuine reconciliation remains unlikely. Moving past family dysfunction requires acknowledgement, accountability, and genuine change in behavior patterns. Without these elements, any attempt at reconciliation would simply recreate the same dynamics that had been so dangerous to my health and well-being. The anniversary of my heart attack has become a day of celebration rather than trauma, marking not just my survival, but my transformation into someone who prioritizes her own health and surrounds herself with people who respect her experiences and needs. I've learned that loving someone does not mean accepting their inability to see your worth, and that sometimes the family you choose loves you better than the one you're born into. This year, I marked the anniversary by speaking at a medical conference about cardiac disease in young women, sharing my story with healthcare professionals who treat patients in my demographic. The presentation focused not just on the medical aspects of early heart attacks, but on the family dynamics that can delay treatment and endanger lives. When a young woman tells you she's having chest pain, I told the audience of doctors and nurses, believe her. When her family says she's being dramatic, believe her anyway. Your willingness to take her seriously might be the difference between life and death. The response to the presentation was overwhelming, with multiple healthcare providers sharing their own experiences of young female patients whose symptoms had been initially dismissed by families or even by medical professionals. The patterns I had experienced were far from unique, representing a broader cultural problem in how women's health concerns are perceived and addressed. My grandmother always told me to trust my instincts, and I wish I had learned sooner that this included trusting them about people too. The people who love you will believe you when you say something is wrong. They will prioritize your safety over their convenience. They will treat your life as valuable and worthy of protection. Now, when I teach young nurses, I tell them that their symptoms are valid, their pain is real, and they deserve to be heard. Because sometimes advocating for yourself isn't just standing up for your feelings. Sometimes it's literally saving your life. The greatest gift you can give yourself is believing you're worth saving even when others don't. And if the people in your life can't or won't recognize your worth, then it's time to find people who will. Have you ever had to advocate for your own health when others didn't believe you? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might help someone else recognize the signs and get the help they need. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real stories about overcoming family dysfunction and medical challenges. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their symptoms are valid and their life is worth protecting. Thank you for listening, and remember that you deserve to be believed, supported, and loved by people who see your true worth. Take care of yourselves and trust your instincts about both your health and the people in your life.